Welcome back to Reboot. For those of you who tuned in earlier, as Andy Bannister helped provide us with the answers to questions asked by our Muslim friends, and to watch Professor John Lennox unlock God's universe for us. Reboot is our day of no question off limits Christian apologetics. My name is Warner, and I'm your host for this Reboot London 2019. If you missed Professor Lennox or Andy Bannister, fear not, as you'll be able to catch up with the talks on the Reboot YouTube channel and on our very own website, rebootglobal.org/London. For the next 45 minutes, you'll be in the company of our panel of apologists who come from all stretches of the world. Our Reboot motto is no question off limits. And we really stand by that. So for the next 45 minutes, sit back, relax, and watch powerful Christian apologetics in action.
Hello. Welcome to the live stream. You guys can scream. How you guys doing? Welcome back. I said welcome back. Yes, I know we're at the home stretch. But I'm glad to welcome you to the final Q&A of the day. We have a panel of brilliant speakers who will field some of the great questions that you have been asking all day. We're going to start it right up now. This was a question that was on the Pigeonhole during the last section, and I never got a chance to ask this one. But I'm going to ask it, and I'm going to allow David to answer. So here's the question. You ready? Okay, good. Let me go over here. How can you lovingly explain, should I introduce you guys first? I'll introduce you guys. How can you lovingly explain to someone that they aren't truly a Christian on the basis that they occasionally attend church or their parents are religious?
Fantastic question, thank you. I would say when we look at the example of Christians throughout history, many of them were given the blessing of a family that was Christian, that taught them scriptures, how to pray. They might have memorized the Beatitudes. In fact, the greatest religious figure in this building that established the very denomination that built this building, John Wesley, wasn't really a Christian. He was an almost Christian. And it wasn't until he was on a boat in the middle of the sea with a storm crashing upon that boat with these Christians called Moravians that were singing with joy in the middle of this crazy situation, that he looked at the faith they had and he said, I'm not really a Christian. I don't have that faith, that inward change. And so when you're confronted with someone who maybe doesn't have the outward fruit of an inner life that's been transformed by Jesus Christ, I think the response is to graciously invite that person deeper. And I think there are times to confront people and say, are you really a Christian, or are you just an almost Christian? And I think the mark that John Wesley himself, who was on that boat, marked out was that there was an internal, inside-out change that brought fruit, an everlasting fruit, and a joy of knowing God intimately as a person. And I think that's what it essentially means to be a Christian. Not to just memorize scripture, not just to have a church background, but to be born from above. And so I think it's exciting when you meet someone that doesn't have that background, doesn't have that background of being truly transformed, because you can lead them into that by the Spirit of God. So thank you for that question. That's great.
Thank you. And I was so rude. Let me just introduce this fine panel. So this is Mr. Simon Edwards.
Hello.
David Bennett. Maklasi Masua. Madeline Jackson. And Andy Bannister. All right, we're going to get right into it. Thank you, David, for answering that. Okay, next question. Is it okay to date non-Christians? Mr. Simon Edwards.
Ooh, okay. Well, if you are a Christian and you date a non-Christian, let's start with this. It's not an unforgivable sin at all, okay? I think the real question that you're wanting to ask is it wise and is it loving? Now, there is a verse in the Bible that talks about not being unequally yoked with an unbeliever. Why would it be loving or wise for us as Christians to think about not being unequally yoked with an unbeliever? What does it mean to be yoked? To me, to be yoked is when you put two oxen together, or an ox and a horse on a yoke, and it basically meant that these two animals would be doing life together for a very long time. Do not be unequally yoked with an unbeliever. What would it be like to partner in life with someone whose fundamental understanding of the universe is significantly different to yours? I think there is a wisdom and there is a love in saying, be careful about who you join yourself with. Now, I recognize that for some people, dating doesn't have the connotations of being yoked. Going out on a date is not the same thing as spending your life together, doing life together, coming from the same fundamental values and orientation in life and doing life together for the rest of your life. But for a Christian, I think we shouldn't take dating lightly. I mean, why do we date? It's not just for personal gratification. It's not just for using the other person for our enjoyment. I would hope as Christians, if we're being integrous, we're actually saying to the person that we're dating, I haven't written off the idea, at the very least, I haven't written off the idea that one day you and I may spend life together, may get married. Now, I'm not promising going out on a date that we're going to get married. On the other hand, why would you go out on a date with someone unless it was in the realm of possibility that you might get married? Now, if there is any relationship on this planet which you should be wise and careful about yoking yourself with, that you would hope and want that you come from the same values and the same orientation, it's got to be marriage, right? What is a more fundamental, important partnering relationship than marriage? And marriage, more often than not, involves kids. And I can tell you, as someone who is a very imperfect person, marriage is not always easy because you have two imperfect people. Except in my case, we have one imperfect person and a perfect person, because my wife is actually perfect. All right? Yeah. Yeah. You know her. Hello, Megan. You know my wife. She's perfect, isn't she? Yeah, you know her as... I've got lots of friends in here, actually. Anyway, but it's hard enough, given the fact we've got kids. I've just had a newborn boy as well. His name's Joseph, born 3 weeks ago. Thank you very much. Now, I can't imagine how difficult it would be as husband and wife raising our children if we didn't both love Jesus and understand that our kids are not here by accident. They're here on purpose because God wanted them to be here, and this God wants to have a relationship with them, and we'll nurture that. If my wife didn't believe that, if she believed something fundamentally different, well, marriage is already hard enough. That would bring some really tough tensions into our relationship. I think it's wise and I think it's loving that God said, think about it before you yoke yourself with someone or enter into an activity that's designed to head in that direction without asking the fundamental question, are we on the same page?
Right. Thank you. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to go to the other side of the stage so that this camera can get a good shot of all of you asking these questions and also hold you accountable unless someone's watching this. Right, so next one. Is masturbation a sin? Please, Ms. Madeline Jackson.
You can giggle, I know.
You can giggle.
This is really a real question, and I think it's one I'm happy to take as a woman, because I think there's a big just conception that masturbation is only something that men struggle with, and it's not true. I remember talking about it with my friend group when I was younger than you guys, just my girlfriends. Like, it was something that people were talking about, were doing, and were trying to figure out what its purpose was. And so it's not something that's just for guys. It's something that I think everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people struggle with. In terms of if it's a sin, I think when we think about sin, let's just think about what it means for something to be a sin. I think a sin is often just thought of as the really fun things that Christians don't do. And that's not what sin is. Sin is actually whenever something good is experienced outside of the context for which it was created. Sin is when something good is experienced outside of the context for which it was created. And so when it comes to masturbation, the question is what purpose is sexual gratification meant for? And Christianity has a view that I think most of you in the room know, but it's important to think about this as we talk about this particular question, is what is marriage for? Marriage is meant to be a union where two people, a man and a woman, come into relationship and serve one another. And in so doing, in laying down their lives for the other, they actually model exactly what Christ did for us on earth when he came and gave his life so that we might have union with him. And so with such a particular picture as the goal of marriage, when we then take sexual gratification outside of the context of a servant-oriented love between two people, and we make it something that is really tempting, something that you can do on your own, have your own pleasure, and it doesn't require intimacy or sacrifice, it's taking something really good that God loves and putting it into a context in which it doesn't serve us well. And I think the reason that I would say when we do masturbate, I think it is sinful, is that it's what Martin Luther calls being curved in on yourself. Sin always takes us away from relationship and focuses on our personal gratification in the moment right now. And that it's not just a physical manifestation, it's something that goes deep into the human heart, that all of us naturally, even if it doesn't express itself in your life in the form of struggling with masturbation, all of us struggle with sin, with not being focused primarily on us having what we want when we want it. I think that's really what it means when the Bible talks about really fleeing from sin. It's fleeing from the really damaging idea that life is all about us getting what we want when we want it. Instead of saying, God, life is better when even having to have self-control sometimes with certain things, I get to experience life how you designed it to be. I want that. And that's why one of the fruits of the Spirit is self-control. Self-control is the ability to say, I want that pleasure now, but I recognize that pleasure is meant to be for intimacy and not for my own personal gratification. And may God give us all more self-control to not do things outside of its context so that our hearts can be transformed outward towards other people's pleasure, other people's joy, and really save what's meant for marriage to be experienced in its fullness in that context. So I hope that gives something to start with in the question of masturbation.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Madeline. Speaking of self-control, Mr. Andy Bannister, can you be a Christian and swear?
I'm sure there's nervous.
Do it.
That's a fine question. Thank you for whoever asked that. Do you know, I think there's a lot of questions that I had as a young Christian when I was a teenager, and I hear from folks in your kind of generation that I think can sort of fall into this bracket of, can I be a Christian and do X? And I think there's two ways of addressing those. One is we can take the particular issue, and I think, for example, Madeline did a wonderful job with the masturbation question of taking, directly on this particular issue. Or I think we can pull the camera lens back slightly and say, look, ultimately, what are we orientating at in life? Do we want to be as close to Jesus and as intimate with him as we can? In which case the answer then becomes, how do I ensure that anything that gets between me and Jesus, I deal with and try and put out of my life? That might be a sexual issue. It might be a language issue. It might be greed. It might be anger. It might be an attitude issue. And it's interesting how often Jesus spoke about the attitude of the heart. And actually, when addressing the language question, Jesus addressed it in terms of, out of your heart, come the things that you say through your mouth. So I would come at the swearing question, not so much at woodenly going, is this word appropriate or that word inappropriate, or in certain circumstances, like when my little sister annoys me, I can say that word, but otherwise not. As how can I ensure that my language reflects my desire to be as close to Christ as possible? Does that mean that sometimes we'll get it wrong? Absolutely it does. And the wonderful thing about the Christian faith, it's not legalistic in the sense of going, because I've said that particular word, it's all over. I can bring that to Jesus and go, Lord, I messed up again. Sorry, can you help me, restore me, and through the work of the Spirit in me, make me more in my language and my attitudes the way you want me to be. But then also I think it's important that we look at our brothers and sisters in Christ and cut them some grace as well. Because I think when I look back as being a younger Christian, swearing was damaging in a couple of ways. One, I think I needed to work on my own language at times. But then when I sort of dealt with that, I then bounced the other way into being horribly judgmental to others who occasionally let a word drop when they shouldn't have done. And I think an interesting challenge for us as disciples of Christ is in how do we show the grace to others that's been extended to us? Not just give a free pass and go anything goes, but go, you know what? My friends at church, at youth group or whatever, Jesus is working on constructing them into being a proper image of him as he is with me. And together, as a community of God's people, we can help one another serve Christ in our attitude, in our deeds, and in our language.
Thank you. That's a good one. When I got here, I was right in the heat of the protests going on down there. So I'll broach this to you, Mr. Masua. How, as Christians, do we react to the climate crisis?
So, one of the issues that was affected by God's world falling into sin and decay is our relationship with the world, with the earth, with our environment. And one of those forms of brokenness is clearly evident in how we have not taken care, or how we have not been good stewards of the earth. And one of the ways in which I think Jesus makes a meaningful contribution to the climate crisis is because on a personal level, as he begins to restore the different relationships between us and God, between us and ourselves, but also between us and what we've been given, the responsibility, the environment to steward, to be good stewards of the earth. And so personally, I can live out my faith in Jesus Christ in the direction of the environment by making adjustments, by showing myself to be a good steward of the environment, whether that's in my own home with regards to cycling, with regards to reducing the carbon footprint, whatever it means for wherever I am, to do my part to show myself to God again that I'm a good steward of the earth, and I take the responsibility seriously. But also at a macro level, there are many of us here who are going to go into other areas as well where we can make a difference with regards to getting involved in, say, issues of policy, for instance, where we can actually put in a policy or implement policies that can really help with this regard. But the idea is that we are not supposed to see the climate crisis as something separate from our faith. We're not supposed to see it as something that is reserved for activists, those activists who are very ethically conscious and so forth. The idea is this world belongs to God, and He sent His Son Jesus Christ to redeem it and to create a new humanity. He is focused on this world, and He enlists us as Christians, as believers, to do our part, to work with Him as He fixes it as well. So to live our faith and to encourage others, no matter where they find themselves, in the personal as well, of course, in the institutional, to live our faith in the direction of the earth, to prove ourselves to be good stewards as well.
Thank you. Thank you. There's a, just so as to, because there's a question here, if you commit suicide, can you go to heaven? Now, we spoke on this, or this was touched on earlier in the day, but just so that we're not, skirting over it, just to remind you, suicide is not the unforgivable sin. Okay? Suicide is not the unforgivable sin. People are saved or redeemed by Christ, not because they've asked for forgiveness for their latest sin. People are saved by trust and reliance and belief in Jesus Christ, okay? So suicide is not the unforgivable sin, just to put that out there. Let's go to this. Would Jesus raid Area 51? I saw it. I wanted to build the tension. I wanted you to think, oh no, he's not gonna ask that. Oh yes, I am.
In the media, it just happened.
Would you like to? Who would like to?
Yeah.
Go for it.
No, mine is a boring answer, and I feel that you want a more profound answer, so I'll start first, and maybe David will give a profound answer. I think there would be no need for him to, because he would know what's really, really going on in Area 51. I think he would cheat in that sense. However, that being said, I think that Jesus would encourage us to be curious about the world and to want to discover all the different things that he's created. And so if there is a place where there's a universe where he's placed alien life and that life has come to Earth, I think that he'd want us to know about it. And so you know where I'm going to be at least.
Nice. Well done.
It says in the Bible that it's God's glory to conceal a matter and man's glory to uncover it. I think that's just like, I think Jesus just likes a party. I think he'd probably just rock up and, join the party afterwards. Yeah.
Hey, wasn't Jesus the first extraterrestrial?
He was fully human, Simon.
But I thought the earth is flat, Simon, so how would we get there anyway?
From another world. Very good. Speaking of other worlds, Simon, why did God make such a big universe only to put life on one small rock?
That's it. It just reminded me, why do we confuse size with significance? This was actually in the late 18th, early 19th century, when people started just discovering how big this universe really is. A lot of atheists came out and said, of course there's not a God. I mean, it makes no sense that God would be so particular and become a person on our tiny little planet when there are billions of planets in the solar system. But when is size and significance meant the same thing? I remember I felt somewhat insignificant when I was at high school. I was actually usually the shortest in my class. I had a very late growth spurt. I probably grew, 30% of my height when I was 17. It was quite late. Now, did I become 30% more significant when I became 30% bigger? And am I getting bigger? Am I getting more significant as I get bigger and bigger every year, or at least as my stomach does anyway? Size and significance, it's completely different things. An elephant is bigger than my 3-week-old son, Joseph. But an elephant is not more significant than my son, Joseph, for that reason, that he's bigger. Now, interestingly, if you were to ask, how big would the universe need to be in order to sustain life such as we experience it today, I think a very strong case can be made, and actually is made, that it would need to be the size that it actually is, to have life such as you and I are, complex life. Actually, some of us are more complex than others, but that's another story. But if you're interested in the very foundations and parameters of our universe and what allows for life, you discover some really interesting things. For example, put up your hand if you know what dark matter is. Has anyone heard of dark matter? Great. Can you come up here and just explain what it is? Because I have no idea, all right? But what I do know is, if there was just a little bit more dark matter is what causes the universe to expand at an increasingly greater rate, all right? I can just quote that definition. I don't entirely know what it means, but I can quote it. Now, if we had just the tiniest little bit more of dark matter in this universe, of the most minuscule fraction, a fraction of 1 over 10 to the power of 138. That's very small in case you don't know mathematics very well. If dark matter, we had that much more dark matter, this universe would not be able to have life. If we had that much less dark matter, we would not be able to have life. In other words, if this universe was much smaller than what it is, there'd be no life. It's the same with if the force of the Big Bang at the beginning of the universe had been any greater or lesser by a fraction of 1 over 10 to the power of 60, that's 1 over 1 with 60 zeros after it, you and I wouldn't be here. But the universe that we have now and the size that it is a result of these scientific constants, which right at the very beginning of the universe were sitting at the exact level of magnitude that you would require for life to exist. For one of them to be out, and there's like 40 or 50 of these things, if just one of them was out by that smallest fraction, there would be no life. The likelihood that each of them would be tuned at just the precise level required for life is of the same probability as somebody blindfolded shooting a gun and hitting a target this big on the other side of the known universe. Not only does the size of our universe and the parameters that have made it to be that size not point away from God, they point to God in a way that is so compelling that even an atheist physicist, a guy by the name of Sir Fred Hoyle, said that a common sense interpretation of the facts about our universe would suggest that a super intellect has monkeyed with the physics and the chemistry. That's an atheist physicist. These things point to God.
Right on.
It's amazing.
Right on. Thank you.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Listen, man, let's keep it going. So, I'm transitioning from male to female. Is God angry at me?
Fantastic. Well, when we think about, being same-sex attracted or gay myself, one doesn't choose one's embodiment. We're given to kind of throw the dice, really, in terms of whether we have gender dysphoria, whether we don't feel gender dysphoria. But I think what's so amazing is that when we become a born-again Christian, when we really become the Christian I was talking about, God comes to dwell in our body. And our body is given a sacred dignity. It's the place that the Most High God wants to come and dwell. And so to say to God, well, I just want to change this or that aspect of my body, I just don't feel that this really fits with, how I feel internally. What you can also know about that God is that God didn't just come to dwell within you, that God also became human. And he didn't just become human, he went up on the cross. And he, as the perfect Son of God, very human, in weak human flesh, went up on that cross and died and felt the greatest form of incongruence within his own self. The perfect, blameless Son of God was killed. If you can just imagine for a moment how that might feel for Jesus, and then think about your own struggle with your own body, Jesus can get you through that. Jesus can get you the strength, give you the strength, even if that never changes, to live faithfully in the body that he has given you. And even if you don't do that, even if you do that, you go down another path, Jesus is always there with grace for you because he knows what that is like. So never think God is just angry at you, but God wants to lead you deeper into a deeper and more sacred relationship with your own body. It is not just a dispensable thing that you change. It has a deep and sacred meaning to God, and he wants to reveal that to you. So don't guilt trip yourself. Don't think God's standing there with wrath over you. God compassionately has shown himself to take on our own estate and has taken on your estate too and understands. And he will give you a spirit of power to live faithfully in that body.
Right.
So awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, I want to follow up with that. How can mental health problems fit into Christianity? David, or anyone? If you don't want to, someone else, please. Please.
Okay, sorry. Okay, how can mental health problems fit into Christianity? It's a really interesting question, and hugely appreciate whoever asked that. I think for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think there's a much greater growing awareness in society that I think we need to do a better job around mental health. It's a broader societal issue that I think mental health services have been underfunded, that I think within the NHS is challenged in a number of areas, but particularly around mental health. And then within the church itself, I think as a reflection of that, sadly sometimes the church reflects society rather than sort of challenges society. I think at times Christians, I think, haven't quite known what to do with mental health issues. I remember running into this myself as a younger Christian in my early 20s. I was diagnosed with depression and brought on by a number of things. And for about a 2-year period, really, wrestled with that, both trying the kind of sort of the pharmacological route, the GP prescribing antidepressants. We tried that, and then we tried talking therapies that worked much better. But I can remember one of the big challenges for me as a Christian wrestling with depression was the response from some, not all, but some of my Christian friends and church leaders who sort of took a kind of, well, all Andy needs is a quick prayer and it'll be all right. Sort of pull yourself together spiritually. And then the other unhelpful approach from some Christians of sort of trying to sort of diagnose what was wrong in my life, what was the secret sin that was causing the depression. And I remember it was very helpful. My counselor was a Christian at one point saying to me, put those thoughts to one side, because if you had a broken leg, presumably your friends at church wouldn't be saying, well, what's the hidden sin that's caused the broken leg? And yet we subject our friends going through mental health with us. Things have got a lot better. I think the church has got a lot better at talking about these issues. Society's got a lot better at recognizing these issues. How does that fit more broadly then into the church? I think, as we've said a number of times up here on the panel this afternoon, and particularly on the environment issue, actually, we were reminded, we live in a broken world. We live in a world that is not the way that God intended it. Sin, when it broke loose in our world through the actions of our first ancestors, and then as each one of us down the generations has repeated that story, sin has done tremendous damage. It's done tremendous damage to relationships. It's done tremendous damage to the environment. It's done tremendous damage to our own bodies. And that's why we shouldn't be surprised that as Christians and our non-Christian friends too, why we have sickness and disease, and why there are mental health issues, because this world is out of whack. So I think that's explaining, why we see the things we do. Then what does the Christian faith say to people who are struggling with those things? Well, I think the church, when it's functioning as it should be a place where actually it's safe to come out and say, look, I'm struggling with sexuality. I'm struggling with mental health. I'm struggling with whatever the issue is, and find support and encouragement, people to come alongside and pray. Yeah, pray for healing, and sometimes God heals. Sometimes he doesn't. I wish I knew the answer as to why sometimes and why not otherwise. But I do know that in Galatians we are told that Christians should carry one another's burdens. And I think there's a tremendous need for the church to be a community where people who are wrestling with mental health issues can make a difference to one another, and then reach out and make a difference to those in the lives around us. I read this astonishing stat just yesterday that I think it's 40% of people who are sleeping rough on our streets here in the UK, and London, like many major cities, has a rough sleeping problem, have mental health issues. There's a tremendous mission opportunity on our doorsteps for the church to be people who don't shut the doors or condemn, but reach out and say, hey, yeah, life is tough because we live in a broken world, but we're going to welcome you in as Jesus welcomed those who are struggling with all issues and none.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to add something on a great answer there. I think it's really interesting when Jesus is confronted with the symptoms of this kind of fallen and broken world. So there's one example where there's a blind man in the Gospels, and everyone's theorizing, like, why is he blind? And of course, mental illness and blindness are not completely, you can't overlap them entirely, but just to talk about the effects of kind of how sin comes into our body and when we're born and all of this. Jesus' response to why the man was blind, why he was unable to see, wasn't because his parents sinned or some kind of weird abstract theory about why do you have mental illness and he says, so that the glory of God can be revealed. I think that's the best answer I've ever heard. I ask God, why am I same-sex attracted or gay? Why isn't it just easy and it all line up in a row? He said, so that the glory of God can be revealed in you, David. Because I'm going to take your greatest weakness and I'm going to turn it into strength. And I think if you're struggling with mental illness or anything, like all these questions that seem to relate to the body and its incongruence with where we feel like it should be, God is going to reveal the most incredible glory in that. So let him do it. And I can tell you in my life, and doesn't mean it's always easy, doesn't mean that there aren't moments of struggle, but there's this overriding sense that the glory of God will be manifested. And in one of Peter's epistles, it talks about if you have a fellowship of Jesus' sufferings, then the Spirit of glory will rest on you. So you can give those sufferings to Jesus, and then the Bible promises that the Spirit of glory will rest on you. And I can tell you, having the Spirit of glory rest on you is the most amazing thing in the whole world. So you want that.
So we have about a little over 9 minutes. We're going to try to squeeze in as many questions as you can. And you thought I skipped over this, but I was just building up anticipation. What is God's opinion on Brexit? See, now I'm tempted to ask a non-Brit, but
Australian. She's most Australian.
Two Australians.
Yeah.
Africa.
Well, I think
All
that's
of you
quite.
speak for God, right?
I can answer that. That's easy.
Okay.
Quickly. God told me yesterday when I was praying, actually, the answer on that one. So God's opinion on Brexit, are you ready for it? Is to keep loving those you disagree with.
Oof. Good. That's good. That's good. That's good. That's good. That actually went much better than I thought. That's great. That is great. In school, the LGBTQ plus community is talked about quite a lot. Oh, where did it go? Shucks. Where is it? It just disappeared. It's right there. That's why. It's talked about quite a lot, like in PS, HE lessons and other lessons. Recently, I was asked by my views on it. So, how do I answer without sounding unloving or judgmental? Madeline or anyone, please.
Yeah.
Please.
Okay, yeah. So I'm really glad whoever is asking this is asking it. I think everyone who is watching the news or just having conversations at school is coming up against this. It's not just at your school. It's not just something that you're wrestling with and somehow don't know how to navigate. It's something that we're all trying to figure out how to do well. And I think that one of the most important things is to recognize that if you've come from a culture in your churches where being within that LGBTQ plus community is seen as kind of the worst possible thing that could happen to you, or the worst possible thing to be involved in, or the end-all be-all sin, that's just not biblical. I think the main thing that we learn in Christianity is that every single human being is not properly does not have a perfect orientation sexually. Every human being is broken. And so when we are engaging with these things, I think our humility to recognize that people in that community aren't any worse off in God's eyes than we are, allows us to start on a really appropriate level of just being able to be a person talking to another person, both desperately in need of the grace of God. And so to just recognize and to also share that message that anytime that those people have been treated within that community as less than or as dirty in some particular way, that there needs to be a lot of forgiveness, a lot of repentance and forgiveness that needs to happen before there can be real dialogue. And that would be my second point, I guess, is that dialogue within this community means being open to answering questions and being open primarily to being a loving friend to whoever is in that community, recognizing that we are not saved because of being on a moral high ground to people of a non-heterosexual orientation. That there is no high ground in Christianity, but that each of us are equal before God, and that as we speak with people that are within that that would identify themselves that way, that we can honor them as children, that people who are made in the image of God and that God is coming after, that God adores, that God values. And so I would say, as in those conversations, honor them as better than yourselves. And that might be more challenging for some than others based on your background, but really challenge yourself. What is it in you that thinks that somehow we're above them in this conversation? It's just not a thing within Christianity. So honor them as greater than yourself. Serve their community. Outdo them in showing honor and love and inclusion within your friend group, within your community. And then have real conversations in the context of friendship, in which they know your love for them before they know your belief about this issue. A lot of times we get that order wrong. So I would just say love them, soften hearts by showing love, and then be able to show conviction when God prompts you to do so. I think one more thing, I think that there's a temptation in these conversations to be like, I'm the token Christian in the room. So almost because it's something that we believe is that God has a certain design for marriage, that it's your duty as a Christian to say it right away, to somehow honor God. Sometimes I think the best thing is to be quiet and ask God to show you when someone, an individual, is ready to have that conversation, and honor God in the way that you speak with them. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me. If you want to add anything.
I just want to super quickly add something. I think in the Bible it talks about a sexual minority in the ancient world called eunuchs. And you can look into this, but it says in Isaiah 56, I will give a name that is better than having sons and daughters to this sexual minority group. And then Jesus actually identifies as a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And then in Acts 8, there's a eunuch who then becomes the spiritual father of a whole continent, namely Africa. So if you want to have a bit of an argument to say, wow, God is radically inclusive, but also retain the truth. It says in that Isaiah 56 verse, to the eunuchs who obey my commands and live according to my ways and Sabbaths, I will give this eternal name. It doesn't compromise the truth that God created male and female in the beginning as very good, but he does radically include the sexual minorities that are known about in the Israelite world, namely eunuchs. And so you can bring that up and say God radically includes people, even if he still calls us to live according to a standard or truth. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a minor point, actually, just to say, it's okay to listen, like Madeline was saying, to people's experiences, and listening to people's experiences and sympathizing with people's experience doesn't mean you have to necessarily accept the interpretation or their interpretation of that experience. Sometimes we can come across as unloving and judgmental because we know already when somebody's sharing their story that we are going to differ about the interpretation, and so we listen to disagree, not to connect with the person, not to understand, not to have an opportunity to actually show what God's love looks like. But yes, of course, we can then, as you've seen today, different people have different interpretations of some of the experiences that you've heard around these issues. And so we know that you don't have to agree with the interpretation, but don't take the shortcut of getting to the explanations of why we differ on how we interpret this, but take time to immerse yourself in people's experience, to listen to people. When I spend a bit of time here, I heard a lot of people say, I hate it when people shove religion down my throat. I hate it when people shove their interpretation down my throat. And when you gave people an opportunity to talk about their stories, all of a sudden they felt as though they wanted to hear what you had to say and what your ideas are. And so I'll just add, take time to really listen to people, knowing that that doesn't automatically force you to accept the interpretation of their experience.
So we have a little over a minute. We're gonna rapid fire the two highest. If you can, just give maybe two bits of advice for each. So the first one, dating as a Christian and the boundaries that come with that. If you had to give possibly one boundary, what would it be? Anyone can answer. One boundary and then give one more. Anyone can take it.
Yeah, I mean, similar to the swearing question we had earlier, I would say, talk it through with your boyfriend or girlfriend, figure it out together, pray it through, and then set the boundaries about 2 meters back from wherever you decided was safe. Because passions run high. That was what my wife and I did when we were dating, because I'm so irresistible. And,
Yes.
but again, keep the goal on you want to honor Christ, discuss it through together, be practical, be sensible, but then set the boundaries just a little bit safer, because that way, if you accidentally break the boundary you've set, you're not over the edge of the cliff.
That's actually really good. Really, really good.
I'll just say one quick thing. I just think sometimes when we talk about this boundary issue, we start really quickly to see Christianity as primarily about those rules, and that it's primarily about making sure God's happy with us and making sure we're being good Christians by not doing this, this, and this, and that. And that is like the hardest thing. That's like white knuckling something where you're meant to. I think it should all begin with asking the question, why? Why do we even want to talk about boundaries? Is there a broader picture? And constantly remind each other, it's not boundaries for boundaries' sake. It's saying, of course I want intimacy with you in that way, but man, I want the intimacy God has for us in the fullest experience possible, the fullest love that we can have, what this was really created for. I want that more. I want to honor you more than I want to have this with you right now. It's not that I don't want that, it's that I want other things more deeply. And let's keep each other accountable to that, because we want the fullest picture. We want the fullest vision to be accomplished in our lives that shows God glory. And that means if it's showing God glory, not that we do it for this reason, but it's also going to be the greatest thing for our relationship. And if dating is for marriage, then man, you want to start investing in the best relationship possible early on. Start honoring each other. Start saying we have a bigger thing and we can be self-controlled for that picture, because that'll affect every area of your relationship later on.
Thank you. We didn't get to the other one, but please give our panel a hand. Please. And thank you. Live stream, thank you. Thank you so much.